Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to a special work session of the Penfield Planning Board and Zoning Board. This meeting is being video recorded and is also being broadcast live on the Town of Penfield's website, penfield.org. The Town of Penfield's Government Access Channel 1303, and on streaming media devices Roku, Apple TV, and Amazon Fire. You can search Penfield TV in your app store and you'll see that it's free, so why not download it or whatever you do with apps, AJ.
Absolutely.
So I don't know if you want to add anything to that. Or So the work session today covers one application that's pending before the Planning Board and the Zoning Board, and it's an application for a cell tower near the Four Corners in Penfield on the fire department property. And both boards have various issues that they need to consider. It's been pending formally pending for probably 3 or 4 months now. One of the things both boards did jointly was to retain a consultant to review the work and the actions of the applicant, honestly, to test those conclusions made by the applicant, and to see if there were further suggestions for action on part of the applicant or the boards. And I think the consultant has finished their work, and we wanted to get in on a special session and pay strict attention to this application alone because it's an important application. Have the consultant present, give the applicant an opportunity to respond if the applicant feels it's necessary, and certainly board members ask questions as well. If you want to add to that, or that's okay. So I think probably the smartest thing for us to do right off the bat is if we could just go across, let's go this way to that way, and just give us your name and the company that you represent. Go slowly so Christine can get it all down. And thanks, everybody, for attending.
Good afternoon. My name is William Johnson, and I am one of the 2 consultants that's working on this project on behalf of the town.
My name is Stephen Ciccarelli, and I am the other RF consultant working on behalf of the town.
My name is Jared Lusk with Nixon Peabody representing Verizon Wireless.
I'm Kathy Pomponio. I'm the project manager representing Verizon Wireless.
Jackie Bartolotta with Tectonic Engineering and Site Acquisition for Verizon Wireless.
Mike Crosby, Verizon Wireless, RF Engineer.
Okay.
John Mancuso from Weaver Mancuso Brightman PLLC, attorneys for the zoning and planning boards with respect to this application.
Good afternoon, Dave Plant, Energy and Environment Practice Leader with Bergman, retained by the town for the visual impact assessment.
Excellent. Everybody else, we're good? Okay. So once again, thanks everybody for being here. I appreciate taking time on a afternoon day, but I think it's going to be time well spent. So why don't we just launch right into your work, your report. I'd ask you just to comment what you were asked to do, and then what you did to achieve that, and then what your conclusions and recommendations, if any, are. And we've received an initial report, and then responses from applicant, and then a supplemental report dated August 8th. I don't know that we've had anything since then or anybody was looking for anything, but just want to make sure everybody has all the documentation. All right, go ahead, launch right into it.
Great, thank you very much. So we were asked to look at the materials and information provided by the applicant and analyze them from an RF engineering perspective with respect to antenna center line. And, well, instead of, let me just do this. We go through, I kind of made myself some notes after going back and forth with Andy a little bit this morning, and let me just summarize a little bit. So we reviewed the engineering necessity case dated December 2nd, 2021. That had the primary RF engineering information from applicant. We also reviewed the project description, site selection analysis, the full plans for the Penfield DT zoning drawings, the most recent update from April 27th. The Federal Airways and Airspace Summary Report dated November 15th, 2021, Verizon co-location policy, photos, both aerial and simulations, dated February 21st, 2021, and then finally, after we filled our preliminary report, the response from Verizon, the third supplemental submission, Exhibit Z primarily, dated August 1st, 2022. So that's the foundation, the material that we use to provide our preliminary report and then also our supplemental report. And this is all regarding the Penfield DT proposed site, the 128-foot monopole, including the 4-foot lightning rod, and set at 120 feet antenna centerline. So that's the basis, the material that we reviewed. I'll summarize our primary findings along with responses from applicant and then our responses to those. So summary findings from the preliminary report dated June 16th. Finding number 1, the proposed site is intended to address poor and inadequate coverage in the geographic area surrounding the site and reduce capacity demands on certain neighboring sites. The 700 megahertz, which is the LTE band, and the 2100 megahertz AWS best server coverage level of negative 105 dBm, upon which the proposed site is designed, is a reasonable value and consistent with other similar macro sites in this region. Finding number 2 from that report, the applicant has demonstrated through simulated coverage maps, so these are computer-based propagation modeling that they included in their information, that the proposed site will increase and improve coverage in the area substantially, especially in the vicinity of the proposed site in the 2100 megahertz, the AWS band. If you have any questions as I'm going, please feel free to stop me because there are several of these.
Well, I'll tell you, while I appreciate everything you've said so far, a lot of it's over my head. So anytime you think that you should translate what you just said into something that I can understand, don't be afraid of offending me.
All right.
Okay, you can talk to me like I'm in kindergarten.
Then I will not do that, but I will.
Feel free.
So I will elaborate just a little bit then.
Okay.
So on that first finding where we talked about addressing poor and inadequate coverage, I talked about the best server coverage level of negative 105 dBm. That basically is a power level as received by handsets when those handsets receiving power, receiving signal from the cellular site. And the level that Verizon used of negative 105 dBm is a power reference level, and that's consistent with analysis that we've seen in this area. So there's nothing, nothing funny going on there.
Right, they use the right number there.
Yes, they use the right number. Through their coverage maps, they have shown that placement of the site, so number 2 here finding, placement of the site will improve coverage and capacity in this region, that there was a coverage gap and that this site does do a reasonable job of addressing that gap.
Go into reasonable a little bit more. So you said it will do a reasonable job. Will it do a fantastic job or a okay job?
I think it will do an adequate job, right? It's difficult to, if I was to redefine that, if I was the RF engineer working on that project, the level that they've chosen, the location that they've chosen, I probably would have done about the same.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
And to answer that question, that's a compromise between what the ideal best service might have been and inadequate service that wouldn't provide the type of service to their subscribers. So they're in between those 2 points. There have been compromises made on height to achieve a better zoning outcome, if possible, as opposed to going for the gold standard of coverage.
So what does that do to the future? Let's say 10 years down the road, are there going to be 6 or 8 additional towers within the immediate vicinity because we didn't want to go to, say, 160 feet now? Is it being short-sighted in that regard?
What you're probably seeing, and you've seen the development of the wireless network within the town of Penfield, placement of sites has been shrinking the distance between those sites. And that's because more and more people are using
Right.
the services. That's a capacity issue. That's probably what you're going to see continuing into the future. There's no way to really predict that. But right now, this site will provide adequate service for the foreseeable future. And Verizon and other carriers may want to come in and put some additional sites in to supplement it when coverage and/or capacity becomes an issue. But for right now, this is an adequate solution for Verizon Wireless based on our analysis.
So I could follow up on that. Let's just say, given present trends, when might we expect somebody to come in and say, hey, we need another tower in this area? If, when might we expect that, as I said, given present?
It's hard to predict that.
Okay.
But one of the questions that Steve really investigated was to try to get an analysis of how the present site, whether increasing the height or decreasing the height, how that would draw capacity off of the adjacent sites. All the adjacent sites that are looking into the Four Corners area are at saturation. They're over capacity, which means at certain times during the day, people are not getting the data throughput that they'd like to get. Maybe their calls are dropping. Maybe they can't even make a call. This site will fix that problem for the near future, but it all depends on, how many more people come on board, how many are demanding wireless services to answer that question. For right now, though, we have a commitment from Verizon's RF engineer that this site, as currently proposed, will do the job. If they found that they needed to cover some of the gap areas, because we did have, and Steve and I had some problems with some of the gap areas, and so we're asking questions about that. In the supplemental materials, they did provide an explanation about how they might be able to solve that problem in the future, if necessary, by using small cells. And this is an approach that has been used. It's in process in the town of Pittsburgh, where 9 small cells were deployed so that they didn't have to put a macro site right in the middle of a neighborhood. But there still is a macro site that has to overlay the whole area.
Are those small cells the ones that look like garbage cans that's on top of a pole?
Exactly, those are the ones. Yeah, FCC limits them to about 50 feet. There's constraints on what the size of the cabinetry can be on the side of the pole. And if it meets all those requirements, it goes into that category of small cell. And that's what I would be talking about regarding future deployments. Right now, this is a macro cell, so this is not a small cell. This is a macro cell.
And you can't replace the macro cell with multiple small cells. You still need the macro to oversee them.
There are big issues to do that. One of the big issues is that the small cell cannot provide the bandwidth, the various frequencies, the bands that are used for cellular communication. Your phone can operate on multiple frequency bands. Okay, the only frequency bands right now that can fit into the cabinetry on a 50-foot telephone pole is what's called the AWS band, which is 2100 megahertz. That's a very narrow, limited spectrum, and as a result, a small cell only covers a very small area. The macro cell, however, can provide a much larger area and can provide much greater bandwidth for the coverage area. So that's why Verizon is proposing a macro cell. The small cells were a attempt to answer our questions about how would you proceed to fill some of the gap areas that remain after this site goes in. And they can do that, according to their RF engineer, using the small cell technology.
Okay.
The photo simulation that shows the tower, that shows one array at the top. Do you know, is the plan where there would be multiple stacking of arrays on that tower, or would it just be the one array?
The information we have is what's in the application material, so I'd have to defer that question to the applicant.
Okay.
Obviously, we have no plans to add additional antennas below ours, but your code prefers co-location, so one can assume that if there are other carriers in the area that need coverage, that they might be seeking to co-locate on that tower, but not from us. But the
Okay.
tower's been designed to host additional
So
co-location.
your hardware, your antenna is obviously the top, and then if there's co-locating, stacking, that would be, of course, below that.
Correct.
Andy, what approval process would be necessary for that, if any, from boards as opposed to administrative.
Well, once the original tower is approved there.
Right.
It's basically just a building permit review process to add
Okay,
antennas to it.
thanks.
And just on that particular point, we did actually include in our preliminary report some information about a FCC regulation that does allow an extension of an existing structure, and this would count, once this is approved, this is going to be counted as an existing structure, and those FCC rules allow, whether it's Verizon or somebody else who's a wireless carrier, to come in and propose an increase in height, and as long as it meets it's a 10% or 20 feet, whichever is greater, extension of that tower, that would be something, if it can mechanically support that addition, that would be something that essentially the municipality, not just Penfield, but all municipalities across the country would have to approve.
And it's just the one-time shot?
One-time shot.
Okay.
Yeah, the reference is
So
always-
if 128 is approved, the highest we'll ever see here is 128 times 110?
Well, it'd be 120 feet plus either 10% or 20 feet, whichever is greater. So
Okay,
you'd be looking at 140 feet.
148 feet would be the highest we ever see. Does that have to be lit, or is it 180?
Under 200, you're good.
200, okay, cool, thanks. Okay, you guys were on a pretty good roll, so keep rolling.
I had one more question. If you had multiple providers, would the footprint for the site accommodate the electronics to drive that?
They would have
Or
to
would it have to increase?
There would have to be additional cabinetry that was included. So each service provider would provide its own cabinetry that would contain the electronics.
So it's,
I think that's your question.
Yeah, so it's conceivable that footprint may have to be increased if there's more providers on that tower.
Conceivably, right.
Okay.
Obviously, they would have to lease that from the Penfield Fire District, as we've discussed the entire time through the project. The real estate that's been made available to us through lease is very small. Typically, on a cell site, you would see 100 by 100. That provides space for additional co-locators. The project here, it's a very small, it's only 880 square feet. So again, while I can't say that somebody won't try and that maybe somebody could fit in there, there could be like Monroe County Emergency Communications could want to go on that tower. Anyone, whatever space we have to lease is what we have to lease. And at that point, they'd have to proceed with the fire district for additional space. As you know from our conversations with the fire district, they've constrained us to this, what I would consider to be small area. I think, again, I can't speak for them, but based on our conversations to date, the likelihood of additional space being available is remote.
Yeah, it's just going to be higher rent.
Yeah, it could be, whatever.
How far away can the equipment go from the actual tower in the event that somebody wanted to co-locate?
I'm not sure that's,
Yeah,
I think
it's a little
that's
bit of a
Mike
loaded question if you know the answer. So it varies, and it varies by provider. So, it is conceivable that another provider may be able to find a way to, if they had a significant amount of equipment, to locate it remotely, say inside the fire department, and then, find a way to get their connectivity to the tower. I'm just saying that there's possibilities that exist there, not necessarily a likelihood.
typically it's usually at the base of the tower, or
Sure.
Yeah.
From a not running extra wires standpoint, right?
Some equipment is more critical to be located closer to the antennas than others, like, for example, the radios that actually power the antennas. Typically nowadays they're located actually at the antenna locations, whereas in the old days we used to locate those in the shelter. So, technology has changed over time, and technology is a little bit different for each carrier depending upon which hardware provider each carrier is using. So there's a lot of variability there, and that's why I can't provide a specific answer for somebody else in that regard.
When you guys co-locate, does that structure that you're proposing allow for someone to use space inside that to put a cabinet, or would it be outside of that structure that you're proposing?
So, like
Does that
I
make
think
sense?
Jared had indicated earlier on, a traditional macro site, like what's proposed here, would commonly have a 50 by 50, 75 by 75, 100 by 100 compound. In that total space, the first carrier would only use a small portion of that, and then there would be remaining space available to be leased out to additional carriers. Since this one has a smaller, more confined space, it's hard to say exactly how that'll play out in the future. And it depends on who it is that wants to co-locate and how much equipment they have.
So currently, you don't have any extra space inside that structure?
That I don't know. I'd have to
If you
defer.
can scroll down to the compound, you can see just how small it is with the, so you can see we're in that, so if you can hear me in the intersection. There's the tower, and obviously there's our 3 cabinets, and so it's, can you say no one can ever fit in there? I can't say no, but the likelihood, based on current design, of someone installing cabinets there is pretty remote.
You just need circulation space around it. Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. I get that. I was just making sure that, to co-locate, you would probably need an additional structure or something out there. It wouldn't be easy.
Like cabinets usually are what people do, right? But we have it enclosed in that fenced, in that pavilion type structure. And again, the size of that's limited by our real estate leasing.
Right.
So that's about as big as you can get based on our lease. And again, I don't know that you could physically get some more cabinets in there to work.
You conceivably could put it in an underground vault, right? Like a big vault.
There's OSHA regulations to do with telecommunications equipment with vaults, so, I can speak for Verizon. That's not something that Verizon would do. It may be something that another carrier would do. We've seen situations, where you're very tight corners like this where you could go vertical. Instead of going underground, you go above. So I think that, it would take some creativity for a second carrier, but it also puts some of that back for the board to be able to regulate it, as to what and how they want it to look like going forward, because with that not being included here, it doesn't allow that TRA law to just bypass the boards. The boards retain some ability to monitor and guide that when the time comes.
Does Verizon, given what Bill and Stephen have said about this additional 10% or 20 feet, does Verizon have veto power over that?
I suspect that if somebody came in and wanted to locate and somebody was going to go on top, Verizon would take the top spot and have them go down on the bottom, where we are now. Again, everybody's
tower.
Yeah, everybody's spacing is a little bit different, what they need, and depending on their frequencies, et cetera. But if somebody was going to go on top, since it's our property and we've made the investment, it's likely we would their application would be to come in to allow Verizon to move up top and then to move into our location.
So just so we can continue to explore what we might see here in the future, if you guys know, how many of your towers do have co-location and how many have expanded under that law or regulation that they're citing, if you know?
I would say that most towers have co-location.
Yeah.
In terms of expansion, it's hard to say.
Okay.
Most of the time that we use the TRA, in my experience, the Tax Relief Act, which he's referencing, that's the federal law that authorizes that, which Professor Johnson discussed. It's to add additional antennas to our existing array. So, you'll change one out and put new ones up. It's not, I can probably count on 1 or 2 fingers in the 5 or 6 years where we have extended a tower for that purpose, in my experience. And I represent Verizon from basically Utica this way and in the Adirondack Park. So does it happen? Yes. Do others use it? Yes. But honestly, what we're seeing is Verizon's usually one of the first to the market, and then others are waiting. You know what I mean? So again, here you do not have the space to accommodate co-location. So you're going to, the fire district, et cetera, is going to be able to control that if they want it.
You indicated in the last session that the fire department had clearly stated what you got is it. There is no more because of their need to be able to turn trucks and move equipment. So to answer your question, there is absolutely no expansion per the fire department based on your discussion the last time. So I just want to kind of verify that there is absolutely, the fire department has said that's the max you're going to get for that property.
Correct. They allowed us to put the trees in and whatnot, but in terms of additional space, so anybody that comes in there, and you're looking at that, we've got cabinets, you've got the utility on the, I'm looking at it on the left side of to the left of the cabinets. I don't know where people would put it. Again, I don't know where technology goes, and maybe their radio's only this big, right? So maybe it could fit in there, but I can tell you in a typical design that we're seeing, they're not going in there.
Andy, can you bring up a aerial view?
While you're bringing that up, let me just add to the conversation. So what you just heard is that it's going to be very difficult to bring co-locators into this site.
Right, but we also heard that.
What does that mean?
Yeah, Kathy, what would you say is a percentage? You said that most towers have co-location. And that would lead me to believe that, I mean, going through this process is part of the cost of doing business, right? But if you're looking to expand or fill out your network in an area and a competitor has a tower that's close enough, I'm guessing that it's a lot easier to work with them to co-locate on an existing tower and go through the process.
That's correct, but in this particular case, and this is a unique situation, the space just isn't there on the ground. It is a very unique situation.
And that's back to my first question and why I brought up the aerial map is, can somebody's co-locating ground equipment be located on an adjacent piece of property and then get everything over to the tower? And how far away would we be? Because it's right, am I talking?
Yeah, those 4 spots, the 4 end spots there.
Yeah, so you'd have, I mean, it wouldn't really have to go far to be, that's the church property, right? Or is that our property, park?
Yep, it is the park.
It is the church's property. The
But
town
it's-
holds an easement over that area for park purposes.
And then just to the north is,
Finney?
is that Finney
No,
right there?
that's a
Finney's
private
further to
business.
the north, right?
Finney's, yeah.
So you do have, you're not talking about a long distance.
No.
15 feet or something, you potentially could get somebody's equipment
So
to co-locate.
these are details that are specific to whatever the new application that comes in, but point.
Understood.
Yeah.
I guess we're all using these things. We're all using them more and more and more, and it's not going to go away. Get that. That said, I don't know if there's any resident in the town of Penfield that's totally stoked about seeing a cell tower right in the 4 corners. So what we're trying to do, I believe, is justify it for the community, and if there's going to be more in the future, how do we plan today as best we can so that something like this can have co-location?
Can't?
Can. So that we're not getting another application from Sprint or somebody next year that, Finney says, oh yeah, sure, we need the money and we'll put a tower up there, and now all of a sudden we have 2 towers.
Right.
Those are the things that I'm trying to cover as best as we can
And that's
in a
exactly the
reasonable
point.
fashion.
Yeah, that's exactly the point I wanted to raise.
So with our application, we have indicated that it's available for co-location, and you have a co-location policy in your law that you require us to make the tower co-locatable from a legal rights perspective and structural capacity. So it's been designed for that. If somebody wants to go to the neighboring property and get another 15, I'm making this up, totally speculative, another 15 by 15 feet, and then go into go into the compound that we have and either expand it onto that property or whatever. Is that technically possible? Yes, pending real estate rights. But again, usually in our projects, we have a big enough ground area at the bottom to host them.
In this case, you don't.
So there's a lot of what-ifs
Right.
if somebody's coming to extend it 20 feet, right? They've got to get the adjacent property. John can tell you, acquiring of adjacent parkland is a bit of a bit troublesome. So that's unlikely to happen. So you're really, in order feasible, the only way to go is go north, and maybe they, for the right price, they'd make sufficient real estate available to a subsequent co-locator.
And sometimes they do go above, as Mike suggested. Sometimes they do go above, but they'd have to come to you. You'd have to review that.
Yeah, I wouldn't look at this as that there's no co-location space available. I would look at this as the additional carriers when they come in, where there's a will, there's a way. You know, and they may say, yeah, it's just easier to build a new tower next door. And the boards could say, that's not going to be easier. You're going to need to find a way to make this work. And when they're pushed to do that, I would suspect that where there's a will, there's a way. And they're going to figure out a way to make that happen. There are technologies.
Which is kind of why I'm going down this rabbit hole.
Yeah, I can't speak for the other carriers. I can just talk to the technologies that exist, and I can talk to the evolution of the technologies. And as time goes on, the flexibility that we have with the equipment that's necessary to operate a cell site continues to improve in flexibility. And so there's a term that we use called CRAN. When CRAN indicates the ability to remotely locate portions of the network in other sites. So for example, you could potentially take a neighboring site, locate half of the hardware there. The other half, the second carrier might only need a power and telco box at the base of the tower instead of a 12 by 16 pad or whatever it is that we've proposed. I don't know the exact, is it 16 by 22 and a half? I don't know the exact dimensions, but
Right.
whatever it is. And again, that's different for each carrier. But when you're faced with a challenge like this, I, as an engineer working for Verizon, would rather find a way to make this site work to co-locate on it as it exists, not to extend it, if possible, and not have to build a new tower. And I believe that anybody else in my shoes would want to do the same thing. So I don't think that there's an interest to just automatically extend the tower or just automatically build another site next to it. If we're in the Adirondack Park, the APA wants you to build a second site immediately next to it, but that's really the exception to how things are done throughout the rest of the state and hundreds of other municipalities.
Yeah, the APA is unique. Typically, municipal code will force you to look at co-location prior to building a new structure. So they would have to do that.
And if you choose to extend here, we're going to need to come in for another variance. Now, the law is going to be a little tricky, right, because we're asking for a reduced setback for our tower.
Right.
Now, if you extend that height, you need an additional variance. You guys are going to be in control of that process when that process happens.
Okay. How much more space is normally needed to co-locate? I know everyone's saying it's different for every carrier, but are we saying if there were 15 more feet there, you'd be able to fit another array in there for another carrier, 10 feet? What's give me a ballpark.
So the antennas that are traditionally used are anywhere from 4 to 8 feet in length. And so typically you have at least 10 feet of separation. The term has evolved over time. It used to be called 10 feet tip to tail, meaning you needed 10 feet from the base of one antenna to the top of the other. Over time, that's been manipulated to more 10 feet center to center, which means the antennas have gotten much closer together. So oftentimes you usually only see a couple feet, below one antenna to the top of the next antenna. It's not ideal from an RF standpoint, but that would be something that you would typically see. So in this case here, where you'd have the likely ability to co-locate at least 2 other carriers below our antennas, there's not, 15, 20 years ago, there was 6 to 8 different wireless carriers. Now you really have 3, maybe 4 if you count some new entries. So, and then additionally, you could have two-way services like Jared mentioned, either fire, county, or other entities like that. But from a traditional wireless telecommunications cellular standpoint, you're really only looking at maybe 2, maybe 3 that would ever want to co-locate on there, at least by what we have available today.
Because right now, the height of the tower is the minimum of what your system could use at the top, meaning anyone below, it would be substandard and probably not
Keep in mind
feasible.
that Verizon's network throughout much of New York State, we have roughly 50% of the wireless subscribers on our network. And so Jared had mentioned oftentimes you see Verizon being the first one into a particular area, and that's because the demand on our network is typically there. And if you take that other 50% and you split it up among 2 or 3 other carriers, their ability to continue to serve the capacity needs like us is oftentimes they have more time than we do to be able to do the same thing. So oftentimes we have gone in there, and it's not always the case. There's other carriers that we co-locate on their towers as well, so we're not always first, but it is oftentimes a scenario where another carrier is going to come along on our coattails and benefit from that, and that's good for them.
And our colleague, this is Dave Weisenreeder from Costage Engineering, who did the engineering. He has some experience with AT&T, and their ground space is typically 12 by 20, is what he's indicated. Now, could it be a little bit different, but you can tell we can't get that in that space, and again, could they go north? Maybe.
Sizes of that equipment getting smaller over time?
Well, we used
Just like everything else?
to use 12 by 30 shelters with a 300 horsepower diesel generator at every site. So if you think about where we've come from there to just putting what you might compare to outdoor refrigerators on a concrete pad, of half that size, I mean, it's significantly improved over time, and I would expect that it will continue to do that. There's
probably more going 4 feet versus 8 feet?
Not with the antennas so much. The physics become involved with the antenna technology, so in order for the antennas to work properly, we still need that longer, lengthy antennas to be able to stack the dipoles inside there to be able to control the signal the way it needs to be controlled. So, 8 foot will probably remain the preferred antenna length, but if there was a space constraint and it was you can either co-locate with a smaller antenna or not co-locate, that's where that compromise would come into play.
If this was done as a stealth tree structure, how would that change, I guess, the design, the height, that sort of thing?
So the antenna center line is what's driving the technology limitations on this site. So that antenna center line would have to remain the same. If you picture a stealth tree, right, that's now going to have to be 5 or 10 feet taller than that to make it look like a tree, if it's going to be a pine tree. And so it would actually increase the overall height of the structure. Doing a stealth site generally reduces the co-location possibilities. Right? And, in terms of the extension, the 20 feet or 10%, if it's a stealth structure, that really defeats the purpose of the stealth structure. So one of the provisions that's in the regulations from the FCC is that that then doesn't fall under that particular requirement necessarily. So a monopole could be extended, but a stealth tree, that's a little bit tough. Now you've got a taller, arguably ugly-looking stealth tree. Foliage in this area, we're looking at things, that are up in that, 90-foot kind of area, right, at top end, right? This site has to be a little bit taller than that so they can shoot over the top of the foliage, because some of the signals that are being used can't really adequately penetrate the foliage. So getting a little bit above the trees, and we see that on the drone videos, the drone shots that we have in the application material. Getting up a little bit above that allows the signal to propagate the way it's supposed to. So we're not going to really see much of a reduction in the antenna center line, but going to a stealth structure, depending on what it is, if it's a tree, it's going to look a little taller.
If you just comment on the stealth tree issue. Verizon Wireless routinely builds trees in the right context, and the context is usually other trees that are near it. Even in the Adirondack Park Agency is primarily where we build, in the Adirondack Park is where we build a lot of these. It works well because we're just above the surrounding foliage and all you see is the tip of the tree. Look, we've as in the Adirondack Park, Kathy and I are dealing with a site now that the tree is about 15 or 20, I would say it's about 20 or 25 feet above the surrounding trees just because of the need at that particular location. It was an inlet. That we've received calls back from the Adirondack Park. They're very concerned about the visibility of that tree because of the way it looks above the tree, and it doesn't look like the tree that you're talking about. Here, it's covered all the way up to about 15 or 20 feet above it. The concern that I have with the stealth tree here is that there's no surrounding pine trees, and it's going to sit there fully, pardon the term, totally naked in the middle of the four corners without the context of the other trees. And I can tell you with the Adirondack Park, they're just concerned with about 20 or 25 feet that's visible, and it doesn't, to their eyes, it doesn't look like the tree they're hoping it to be. And we're using the, when I tell you without no BS, the best design, needle design, tree design that you can buy, most full needles and et cetera. And again, it's all about context. And in this location, as I said before the board, if there were other evergreen trees that were in this four corners that we could blend with or on this site, it would look fantastic. Here, you don't have it. You're not going to get what you'd like with a stealth tree if you propose it. It's just, you're going to wish we didn't do it. And it's getting awfully tall because you just don't see 130-foot pine trees anywhere in this part of the world.
Yeah, I know there's one at Star Lake behind the fire hall, and you wouldn't even know it's there.
Right.
Because the tree line is so high.
Right. I did that tower, and again, where there's context, we have them at the Knickerbocker Farm in Pittsford. Again, it's other trees, pine trees that are right there with them, and you can't tell the difference. It's all about context.
Okay, thank you.
You guys can keep going if you want.
All right, great.
We've had a lot of good questions and good responses.
Yeah, this is great, so please do as we go through this. If you have questions or we need dialogue, that's a good time to stop me. If you look at, and again, the preliminary report, if you look at findings 3, 4, and 5, they basically deal with increasing the capacity and offloading traffic from neighboring sites, and we did talk a little bit about that. Finding 5 specifically, we state that it's clear that the proposed site will offload capacity from the 4 sites and sectors mentioned. The applicant had not at that point demonstrated quantitatively the extent to which the proposed site would reduce the congestion at the 4 current sites. So we asked that the applicant provide data if it was available. We said here it's recommended the applicant provide quantitative simulations or use other methodology demonstrating the impact of the proposed site on the reduction of congestion on the neighboring sites and sectors. So as those sites get overloaded and we have a new site that's proposed, once that new site is on air, how much of that traffic will actually pull from those adjacent sites and sectors. So we would like to try to quantitatively get that information. In response to that finding in our preliminary report, applicant did not provide exact quantitative data due to limitations of computer modeling software. We've had discussions with applicant's RF engineer. That data just isn't really available until after they get the site up and running to see how much of that congestion is relieved. But by viewing the propagation plots that we were provided by applicant, in our opinion, at the proposed antenna center line of 120 feet, there is significant coverage overlap with the fringe areas. Fringe areas are areas that as you get further away from the cellular site, the level of the power from the cellular site to the handset and also from the handset to the cellular site, that link is not as strong, the power levels go down, and you start to see things like data rates dropping or dropped calls. And of course, when you get a dropped call, then the handset is trying to talk to whatever cell site it can, and that also causes congestion on the control channels. So there is overlap with the fringe areas of the neighboring sites. And if the ACL is reduced below the 120 feet, what we see here is as the ACL is lowered, the overlap is lowered in the fringe areas, and hence that implies a diminished amount of capacity offloading. So while applicant was unable to provide us exact quantitative data, there is significant overlap now, and if we were to lower the ACL of the proposed site, the overlap would drop, and hence the congestion would not be relieved as much.
Yeah. I mean, your last sentence there, in where you give you the opinion that the 128-foot tower with the lightning rod is likely the minimum height to achieve the best compromise between aesthetic concern. I mean, that kind of sums it up pretty good. All right.
So I don't know if there's any discussion, any additional discussion on that point.
I've got one in terms of talking about the height. If this tower increased, let's say 10 feet, does that future-proof this site longer? Does that, prevents other sites from, being built up as quickly around the area? I don't know who's better to answer that, but, if we're thinking about, looking down the road and trying to avoid, additional towers, additional things like that going in, does 10 feet make a huge difference? Where does that next line draw where all of a sudden we say, hey, we're better for a longer time before we put more towers in? And I realize as, we're more the data world now, and closer towers put together that aren't necessarily as big as, as times go on, but how much more time would that give us if that is even a question you can answer?
Yeah. I would have to defer that to Verizon's RF engineer, dealing with their system specifically.
Yeah, so this is, you know, as the question started off, looking for quantitative data, this isn't the easiest question to answer. From my perspective, you know, I have close to 30 years of experience building cell sites. I've been involved with thousands of new sites, so I have as much experience as you can get when it comes to knowing what to expect from a site, because I've not always gotten it right. We've made mistakes, we've learned from those mistakes, and that's something that I'd love to find a way to share that information in the best way possible, but the computer simulations are really, they're really designed to help me, the engineer, to interpret what's happening with our network and how do we fix it. And trying to articulate that into words or into a table that I can share with everybody is not always the easiest thing. But what I would share is that the way I look at the network and the solutions that we provide, it's a balance between a solution that's too big and causes interference with neighboring cells or with faraway locations, like, for example, the city of Rochester, which you can see in the drone videos, or a site that's too short, that's obstructed by adjacent clutter and not able to serve its objectives, causing additional tower proliferation. To me, that's the concern. And so I think the question is good. Is the tower tall enough? That's not a question that we get all the time, but it's a question that should be asked. Every time the question is asked is, can you go lower? You should ask a balanced question of, or should it go higher? And I think that's a really good conversation to have in the sense of, I don't hear it that often. It happens. It usually happens in suburban to rural areas, especially when a supervisor's house is not served by the proposed site. But in the case with Penfield, in this particular location, this is the right balance between not having too large of a site and also having a site that meets the minimum objectives necessary in order to serve the area that we're trying to serve. So we do have, as everybody knows, there's some coverage in the area now. But as Steve has articulated, we have different bands of service that provide different bandwidths and different services. Those are all aggregated together. We can't aggregate those services together if they don't exist because the sites don't serve in that area. That's what the situation is right now. Our neighboring sites provide some service, but not enough of it that we can aggregate those services together and to be able to provide the capacity and coverage that's needed. So this is a good balance for us. I really think that it's, in fact, you know, I don't know if I've mentioned this before or not, but this project was actually started by another engineer, and I was actually spending a lot of time working in the Hudson Valley. And when I picked this project up last year, late last year, maybe third or fourth quarter, you know, one of the things that I first looked at was, you know, how did this engineer design the site? You know, what height is it? Does it really need to be that tall, or is it not tall enough? And it was a pleasant surprise that the engineer had done everything they were supposed to do, and the site was really properly designed. So we've been able to maintain consistency from start to finish on this site, that proposed height is exactly what's needed for here. If the tower is extended at some point in the future, as Jared mentioned, it is customary for the existing anchor tenant who built the site to want to preserve their top spot on the tower. That's not anything out of the ordinary. We would probably try to do that if it doesn't cause interference and if it's justified at the time. But if we determine that 120 or 124 is as high as we want to go, then we would say you're more than welcome to go higher than us. But each carrier has a little bit different needs because of some of the things we talked about, different technologies, different bandwidths, different frequencies, different customer bases and demand on their network. So it's not all, you know, a rubber stamp for each carrier. There's customization that's necessary for each site. So I think it's a good balance of not too big, not too small.
Thank you.
One quick supplement. If there is a future carrier, likely it would be a 10-foot tower extension, not the 20. Typically, most carriers do use the 8-foot panel antennas.
You might need to talk into the microphone.
Most of the carriers do use 8-foot panel antennas, and there's a 2-foot tip-to-tail separation distance between the bottom and the top of the antennas. So a 10-foot extension would likely occur if there were another carrier coming to the site.
And I note throughout the supplemental report, in any event, there's reference to the possibility that these small cells might be needed in the future to fill any remaining gaps. What's your comment on that? Is that the likelihood of that being needed?
I think that it is likely that we would need some supplemental sites in the future. There is a slide, of course, I don't have the exact page number up here, but it's one of the last slides in the supplemental RF submission that actually shows the proposed site coverage as well as stars that show proposed future locations and potential future locations. So in that slide, we actually do show one location at the high school, where we are currently working to try to provide supplemental capacity coverage at the school, because we know that this site by itself is not going to be enough. And then areas, the gaps that the consultants had mentioned that they were concerned about, those areas are conceivable that we would be able to solve those with small cells as well. So we call this a hybrid approach. And one comment about macro sites versus small cells, you wouldn't typically see a group of small cells that would displace the need for the macro. In this case, we have a problem area that's macro size problem. And so in order to solve that, we really need to be able to provide service in the area. This is a relatively large gap in service for this dense of a suburban area. So it's a good thing that this, in my opinion, that this is getting solved so that as we go forward in the future, we would be able to look at small cell solutions to fill in any remaining gaps.
And is that what you were talking about?
So that the green star that's to the northeast of the proposed site, that's the high school. And then the red stars that are around that area, those are not based on anything other than just hypothetical locations where we could possibly use existing utility poles, buildings, or possibly plant, a utility pole to mount equipment on. That would be in small cell in nature to solve those areas. One of the challenges that we have in the town of Penfield is that in some of the dense residential areas around the cell site that we're proposing, there is not existing utility infrastructure above ground that would allow us to do that. So this would be using areas where there is existing. So it is hypothetical, but yet it is thought out, at least to the point that we're aware of where there are resources and where there are not.
I may have missed it, and if I did, I apologize, but on page 2 of your supplemental report, there's a couple of comments about power backup and potential noise abatement issues. If you want to elaborate a little bit on that, and then if you guys could respond to that, I'd appreciate it.
So I assume you're bringing up site details, page 2 of 4?
Right.
Okay, yep. So in the original site plan that we reviewed, there was no mention of a power backup generator. So sometimes communities are concerned about the noise that a backup generator will make and how far that noise will propagate through the community. So we just put that in there so that the board could be aware of that and perhaps ask applicant about their plans for backup power.
In this instance, Verizon Wireless did decide not to do the backup generator. Standard battery will last like 4 hours, standard batteries. They do have an extra battery cabinet they can put in so they will last 8 hours. And they also have frequently in the past used like a cam lock connection, so they could do a roll-up generator if need be, if it power outage lasted longer than that.
Okay, and under that circumstance, what, if anything, could be done to reduce the noise level for?
There is, without the generator? Or if you were at a roll-up generator, you mean?
If you got to the point where you needed that roll-up generator. I mean, I don't know if there is anything.
If there's no power,
right.
Everybody's going to be happy to have cell coverage, I'm sure.
Yeah, okay, good point.
Yeah, if we had another ice storm 1991 scenario, and the existing sites were overburdened to the point where we needed to roll a generator for this location,
people aren't going to care about the noise from the generator.
They're not going to mind. Well, everybody's going to have a generator running up and down the street at that point. So.
Yeah,
I was wondering if the fire department had a backup
they do.
system.
They have a large, it's got to be 175 kW diesel outside.
So, I mean, I don't believe it's been proposed, but that's certainly an option to be able to tap into that.
Yeah.
Versus if that one is running, I'm sure any roll-up that they were to bring there would be drowned out by that larger unit running anyways. I can't imagine.
I'm not sure they're going to let us go on their generator.
I don't know if you had anything more?
Yeah, a little bit, but
Okay.
Much of this has already been covered, so I'll just kind of boil it down here a little bit. In our preliminary report, finding 6, we basically requested applicant to provide coverage maps at varying ACLs so we could see what happened as the antenna center line was reduced. They did do that in addition to providing some drone flight video. And basically, they did illustrate that a reduction of ACL beyond the 120 feet would reduce the coverage in a significant way. So again, we find that the 120 feet was adequate. So we've kind of discussed that, but we did bring that up. Applicant also provided a table comparing the ACL of the proposed site to neighboring sites in the area. So the Penfield DT proposed site, the antenna center line is 120 feet, and the 4 neighboring sites that they discuss in their application materials that the traffic is being drawn from for the Penfield DT site, those ACLs are between 120 and 164 feet. So this would actually be one of the smaller ones. In the preliminary report, findings 7 through 12 didn't require any responses from the applicant, but got into FA lighting and marking, which was not required for this. Exposure limits, those kinds of things, just boilerplate. The last preliminary report finding of interest for this is that the proposed RF coverage shows that gaps will remain. In fact, that map you had up, if you could just pull that back up, Andy. It was the the supplemental from Verizon, the 4th page from the end there. There you go, yep.
With the stars.
With the stars, there you go, okay. So applicant provided this in their supplemental materials. We also, by looking at this, we think that there's a potential need for potentially additional small cells, mid-band small cells in the, let me just find that here. Yes, in the northwest quadrant, in the vicinity of Dolomite Products, and in the southwest quadrant, in the vicinity of Channing H. Philbrook Park. So we just wanted to bring that up for the board based on our looking at this map. But neither of these areas are densely populated, so the need for additional mid-band small cell sites may not exist for some time, as long as applicants' LTE coverage and capacity are not overburdened. We don't have specific information on their capacity of their network in those areas, but wanted to bring those up as those might be additional places that the applicant would want to put in small cells.
And I think Mr. Crosby indicated that it's likely that something like this would be in the future for Penfield, but undefined as to when that would be.
And I don't know if applicant has additional information on that, or?
As I said in our letter, this is speculative in a sense that we're going to get this, hopefully if it gets approved, we'll get this turned on, use it, see, as Mike indicated, we'll see the offload, how it works, then see what the real need is after the fact, and then it's very specific, the design of the network and where it's actually needed, and at that point they'll be able to make the best assessment about what, if any, additional small cells are needed and when.
I would add that these additional solutions that may be needed in the future are, typically much more palatable from a zoning standpoint.
Yeah, we hit, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but don't we have it near Panorama Plaza?
There is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So usually those are, I wouldn't expect that those are, that's going to be nothing like the process that we're going through now. So I would just suggest that.
You don't like this process?
How could you not like this process? It just wouldn't be a burden as much on
We
the.
just got 9 of them approved in Pittsburgh.
Oh, Pittsburgh, New York?
Pittsburgh, New York.
It was actually, I think Mr. Johnson had mentioned, it's actually, he had mentioned Pittsburgh when he was comparing this design here, in the sense that while it's not needed by the network at this time, the future solutions would follow that hybrid plan approach that we're using in Pittsburgh right now, where we had a macro site designed to work in conjunction with 9 small cells. So wherever we can, we try to break that up so that we're not building, say, 3 macros if we can, and do it in a way that's, less intrusive to the community. We certainly try to do that. And that would be the case here, where we're doing the macro now, which is the proper order of doing things. We're not the tail, wagging the dog, so to speak. This allows us the ability to tread lightly in the future, which is what our intent is. Hopefully it will work out that way. That's the plan.
Okay. Any other questions from anyone? The only other thing that I wanted to touch upon, I've sort of already formed my conclusion on this, but they're asking for very significant variances. Okay. But it really, from your reports, whether they could move it 10 feet this way or 10 feet that, it's just, minimal, if any, effect whatsoever on it. Okay. All right. Anything else, anyone? Anybody else? I mean, it's, okay. I think,
Would you like to hear from our other consultant?
sure. Bergman.
Good afternoon, everybody. Again, Dave Plant with Bergman, asked by the town to review the visual impact assessment items from the application. We were brought on in May to look at the initial submission that was prepared by the applicant, which included the initial visual impact assessment and photo renderings of the proposed tower, the balloon flight visibility map, and the site plan set. And so we performed an initial review of all those items, completed first round of comments on those items, and sent those back towards the end of June. Beginning of June. And Verizon responded to that in response to my comments on the visual impact assessment. So some of those comments mostly were around, the adequacy and efficacy of the visual impact map and the radii for which a typical visual impact assessment is done away from a proposed tower. Also had some comments in there about impacts on the historic district, Penfield Road Historic District, that is adjacent to the proposed tower. And so that was the majority of my comments in the first submission. They responded with a revised site plan set that included additional landscaping to address some of those on-site landscaping that addressed some of those adverse visual impact comments. And then the only comment that I had that went into my second report on July 7th was regarding potential for off-site tree planting to further mitigate any impacts to the historic buildings to the east of the project site. In between when that comment letter was submitted and Jared's follow-up letter towards the middle of July, they received their SHPO sign-off from the State Historic Preservation Office indicating that SHPO themselves had no concerns that the proposed cell tower had no significant adverse impact to the visual characteristics of the Penfield Road Historic District. So that was the last comment that I had that was open in my memo, and sent back another confirmation letter shortly thereafter to the town, letting them know that my concerns and comments had been addressed by the applicant.
Okay. Any questions for Dave?
I wanted to make a few comments. As far as the historic districts and historic sites, if you take a 1 mile radius out around that tower, it incorporates 100% of 2 historic districts in the town, and it also contains 18 historic landmarks. And my only comment about SHPO is they are only looking at state and national designations. So any local designations, they don't even see. So, I think it's important seeing what the visual impact is going to be in those districts and those sites.
Anybody else for Dave or? I don't know how would we intend to address that, seeing the visual impacts.
And I think that's the big issue, is the visual.
Okay.
We have provided the view shed map that showed the visibility. We provided the photo sims that show the tower. I don't know how, I'm unaware of another way other than the balloon fly and the view shed map. The view shed map was created as a result of the balloon fly. And then there's topographical based view shed maps, as you know, but obviously we've provided you with a pretty specific visibility map that Bergman provided a question to, and we responded to. The bulk of the of the tower is visible within that mile or less radius, with just those few, I call them finger views of coming up the hill on 441 from Philbrook Park area. It's just visible from a couple of those areas, but primarily it's visible less than a mile from the facility.
Yeah, I know it's difficult when you see it as a rendition, and I mean, planning board, we've gone through many projects where we get detailed renditions, and then when you see it for real, it's a lot of times can be surprising, what the result is.
This is a little simpler because the
Yeah.
structure itself is simpler, and those are actual towers that are used as the simulation. It's a little bit of art, sizing, and et cetera, but those are actual towers that are used. So again, these are as accurate as I think are reasonably possible.
Okay.
Actually, seeing that raise another issue in my mind, and I don't know that we've talked about this at all, but years ago, when towers we were seeing them 2-3 times a year applications, there was always a concern about safety and fall zone and all that. So can you just talk a little bit about that here? Since no one's raised it, I'm assuming it's really not an issue in everybody's mind, but it'd be good to put that on the record too.
Some work that I have been involved in over the years is with a broadcast facility in Syracuse, 365-foot tower. It's probably about 30 or 40 feet off the back of the building, which is occupied. We have had situations where icing has occurred, and the problem with a tower, it's being a metal structure, if you get freezing rain hitting a below freezing metal structure, it pretty much instantaneously freezes. We've had that tower load up with ice. There are specifications for the design of the tower that take into account the structural capacity of the tower to hold that amount of ice, about what might be expected in an area like this. But your point is well taken, and this is true with traffic stanchions. Steel traffic stanchions, they'll freeze as well. And when that ice sheds, as soon as the sun starts to hit the metal structure and the temperature starts to go above freezing, at some point that ice can no longer hang on to the structure, and you have a massive reduction of that ice off of that tower.
You put that nice, a reduction of falling icicles.
I've had a little practice with that, with that phrase. So it doesn't necessarily, blow 100 feet away from where the tower is, but it does drop at the base. And that's why oftentimes a tower is removed from occupied locations. That's why, in this case, that there is a shelter over the equipment. So if ice does shed, it's not going to start clobbering the equipment, because that could be a pretty large amount of ice that comes off. But, this is a occasional kind of a problem. It's not the normal sort of thing that you'd see, and there's many other situations where you can have ice shedding.
Correct me if I took your comment as the tower falling.
That was my comment. I didn't even think about ice, but that was a lot more interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, I really read into that.
And
falling. Yeah.
I mean, I've always wanted to
Wind
know
blowing it down.
how many towers have fallen
Right.
in the United States in the last 30 years.
Yeah, so there is, I don't have that information right at my fingertips here, but there is a website that does contain information like that talks about various types of towers that have collapsed or failed for various reasons. Towers can fall because of mechanical failures when they're not properly maintained. They fall sometimes when they're under construction, when the riggers aren't taking precautions or something bad happens. But, these are all sort of outlier kind of problems, and there are times that towers will fall. One of the techniques, and again, I don't want to impose this on Verizon, they may want to speak to this particular point, but there is the opportunity to put in a structure. It's a link that's partway up the tower, and I don't want to call it by its actual name because it misrepresents. But what happens is you design the link to meet the current construction code for the tower, and then you over-design the base of the tower. And what happens is when the wind and torque become too much, instead of the tower breaking at the base, What it does is it breaks at that junction that's partway up the tower. And, in the past, as Mike Crosby put it before, in the good old days, there were lots of coaxial cables that were going up through the center of that tower, and it's kind of like your arm. When your arm breaks, it doesn't fall off. It hangs on by the tendons. But this link will stress, and whichever direction the wind is blowing from, it'll fracture from the direction the wind is blowing, and it'll hinge at the other side. And then if the tower was going to go over, which is kind of rare, that it would then hinge on that particular point. What usually happens is the tower, whether it has this link in it or not, would bend to a particular point, and once it reduces that wind load, that's pretty much where it stays. It'll have to be taken down at that point because it's damaged, but at least it doesn't, towers very rarely go end over end on top of things. However, not to say that couldn't happen, it hasn't happened. Guide towers, and this is not a guide wire tower, guide towers would be very susceptible to that kind of a problem. But a monopole, maybe Verizon would like to speak to that particular point, but there are things that can be done to make it safer in the senses that I've just described with a monopole tower.
Great, thanks for that. Sure.
Mr. Chairman, tab M of our application was a structural design letter, and it describes the standard under which it would be built to. And again, it's a technical standard. You can read it. I won't read it.
No, just, is there any reason for us to be concerned that this is because of where it's going, safety has not been adequately addressed?
No fall zone.
Right.
It's obviously a much smaller fall zone. It's designed to 109 mile an hour wind gust. Again, that's not iced, right? And they do accommodate that for ice, but again, Verizon designed these towers to stay in the air, right? They're not designed to go down, and I'm unaware in my 27 years of any coming down. Here, it's a smaller area. Wind comes from the west, right? Typically, if it was going to go, it would head towards the church parking lot, et cetera. So again, it's going to fall on itself, and generally like this is what I see. And so again, it is likely to come down and end up probably within the compound or close to it.
And we do build these adjacent to occupied buildings often, so.
Okay.
And it's really impossible to design to preclude any strange situation like that happening. We've seen in Rochester, we've seen microbursts that took down rows of telephone poles. Those were not designed to withstand that type of a force. We saw a couple of winters ago severe windstorms that came in. Actually, meteorologically, it was at a 45-degree angle coming down, so the wind wasn't being blocked, and that caused a lot of damage. As we know, it took down traffic lights and light stanchions and all sorts of things. So, I mean, you really can't reasonably preclude all possibilities, but the design specifications are made to handle the most likely type of situations that would occur, and that's what Verizon is committed to design to.
Okay.
If something like that happened, the tower won't be the only thing that's down, we'll say that.
Exactly.
All right, anything else from anyone, of any consultant or the applicant? Okay, I think we'll then just close the work session. It's on our agenda for Thursday. I don't know when your next meeting is, but.
Be our September
9th.
9th meeting.
Okay, so I don't know that we have to take any action today. It's just
Where's
considered
the shot
table.
clock stand right now?
Our next meeting.
Our next
September
meeting?
9th?
September
The day-
8th.
Yeah, the day after the planning board's meeting is September
Okay,
9th.
so we're good that way. All right.
Okay, anyone else? Last chance? All right, excellent work, everybody. Really appreciate everybody's time and effort on this side and that side. Well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.